I just couldn't fathom them out. Why would they do this to us? We're the same as them, we're human beings. Why are they brainwashing us? And it was especially good because we could call on American support. And the Americans were always just too willing to become involved in a firefight. The instructors were your friends. During the day, you had to say yes sir, or yes corporal, or no sergeant. But when the day was finished, it was Tom, Joe, Dick and Harry, and they drank the same beer as we did. At no time during all that training or leave did it ever enter my mind that I would not come back. Realisation that we were in a war zone, that people would die, friends would die, friends would be wounded. Yeah, Ian Leis, born in 1948, August 1948. I'm the youngest of a family of 6. I had 2 brothers, 3 sisters. I was born in Casino in New South Wales on a dairy farm. The idea of earning more money was, I still worked of a weekend, I worked of a night time, and we were still only basically making ends meet. So I had a few mates at that time had been called up, conscripted. The idea came into my head that, yeah, I'll probably be conscripted too. My dad, he got to me and he said, well look, he said, why don't you join the army and go in the regular supplement, which was for 3 years. He said, first of all, it'll keep you out of jail, because he said, I reckon that's where you'll end up. And he said, it'll also give you a bit more finance. He said, and it might put a bit of discipline into you and make you a man. So I joined the army in November 1967. Probably the hardest part of that was leaving Glenn and our son Frankie. But I set out to prove that I could do it. I was physically fit. I wasn't ready mentally at all for what the army put up in front of me, or what they did to, they threw at us. The first 3 months at Kapuka, it was bastardisation. It really was. Your life wasn't your own. You had no time to yourself. You were at their beck and call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The physical side of it wasn't a problem. That mental side of it and the discipline was. I really didn't handle discipline, The discipline side of it, or my lack of discipline, or the understanding of the discipline, got me into a lot of strife. I did a lot of extra duties. I lost a lot of leave. And that 3 months at Kapuka probably was some of the longest and hardest time of my life. It was the biggest shock I had had to that stage about what life was about. Yes sir, no sir, 3 bag full sir. And just walking 20 kilometres with all your gear on and things like that. Even though I was physically fit, the reasons behind it just were, I just couldn't fathom them out. Why would they do this to us? We're the same as them, we're human beings. Why are they brainwashing us, So after I did get through rookie training, and I got through it reasonably well. Made a lot of friends there. I made friends there that I actually am still friends with today. Deep friendship. When we left Kapuka, about 80% of the group that I went through were transferred to infantry, to do infantry corps training. Having been in amongst vehicles and engineering works, I applied to be into engineers. that just fell on deaf ears. They were looking for infantry people. They wanted people to go to Vietnam. All our training had been done, in hindsight, all our training had been done to prepare us for posting to Vietnam, even at that early stage. Some of the instructors at Kapooka, very few of them, but some of them had actually done a tour of Vietnam, the senior NCOs. However, many of them weren't, and they were just there to install bastardisation, as I said, into us and to get us to accept that discipline without question. Left Kapooka, went to the infantry centre at Ingleburn in Sydney. Once again, it was very, very hard, demanding physically. However, the training and the insight that they taught us, we actually felt we were learning something, or I did. And the instructors that were there, well, it was the opposite to Kapooka. They, even though they were demanding, they were your friend. And they had actually been there and done that. So it was much easier to listen to the infantry instructors than what it was with the core training, the rookie training instructors. At the infantry centre, I performed very well. I actually, when I marched out of the infantry centre, I come out as the best trainee of my group, which surprised me as well as many other people. I had used weapons before I went into the army. I had been shooting pigs, kangaroos, things like that. So I wasn't frightened of using a weapon. The weapons were of interest to me, to handle machine guns, submachine guns, the old Owen machine gun, the SLR rifle, to see its capabilities. They were really frightening to some people. Some people had come out of railway workers, you know, they'd never handled a weapon, let alone fired one. To be trained to use these weapons and to go onto the rifle range, that was an adventure. It was fun, something I enjoyed. On leaving the infantry centre, I was posted to 5 Battalion, an infantry battalion at Holsworthy. Once again, the mates that I had made in friendship went with me. In many occasions, or in most occasions, to the same company, same platoon, same section. Some of the other chaps that I was with went to the same battalion but were in different companies. So even though they were spread over a bigger area, we were still in contact. We were still together. Battalion training was full on preparation for Vietnam. We were told we would go to Vietnam, but we weren't given a date at that stage. We were just told that we were preparing for displacement to Vietnam. The instructors that we run into within the battalion had virtually all done a tour of Vietnam, the NCOs. Some of the officers hadn't, and some of the senior NCOs hadn't. However, some of those had been to Malaya, and in fact some of them had fought in Korea. So you had respect for them because they had been there and done it. Battalion training was very, very intense physically again. A lot of drill, parade ground drill, weapons drill, fieldcraft. It just wasn't taught, it was explained to you why it was needed and why it would save your life in time. The instructors were your friends. During the day, you had to say yes sir, or yes corporal, or no sergeant. But when the day was finished, it was Tom, Joe, Dick and Harry, and they drank the same beer as we did. A big bond was built there, a tremendous bond and respect for some. We had a company commander who should not have even been in the army, let alone a company commander. He was despised by all, not only within our company, but within the battalion. A major. This major would go out on, or take us out on training operations, and when we had to sleep out in our field gear, in the freezing cold, he would hop in his black Mercedes with his beautiful blonde wife driving and head off to town and stay in a motel for the night. He would arrive back the next morning having had his bacon and eggs for breakfast and the fruits from his beautiful blonde wife, in his starched greens, well shaven, line us up after we'd finished our ration packs and say, well, this is what's in front of you boys, this is what you've got to get used to living, this is how you're going to live in Vietnam. And he was going to be our company commander. On one occasion, on one of these parades, he produced a big bar of Cadbury chocolate out of his pockets on his greens and stood on the parade and ate this chocolate and said that we would have to learn to subsidise our ration packs in this manner. So the next morning when he arrived in his black Mercedes, Matt and I waited till he was not in sight. We approached his wife to buy us some chocolates and bring them out the next day, which she quite obligingly said that would not be any problem whatsoever. He would have locked us up and charged us and threw away the key when he found out that we had the audacity and the cheek to ask his wife, the wife of a major, to buy us lowly privates chocolates. So that was pretty funny, you know, that lived on for quite some time. So we produced our chocolates on parade that morning and started eating them. The only difference was we shared ours with the rest of the platoon. We were giving a posting date to go to Vietnam, so that involved medical preparation, kit preparation, moving around within the company to different platoons, to different sections. Everything was just finely geared and really polished to perfection. And that was in 1968. We left to go to Vietnam January 1969. Had pre-embarkation leave back in Brisbane. At no time during all that training or leave did it ever enter my mind that I would not come back from Vietnam. Indeed, I thought we would all come back. We left on the HMAS Sydney, the aircraft carrier which had been converted to a troop carrier. This was the biggest adventure you could imagine. Fun, jokes, pranks, trying to hide on an aircraft carrier. During that time on the boat, we practiced weapon drills off the flight deck, firing at targets that they towed behind the Sydney. We did PE on the flight deck, physical training. It was during that time that I became the company barber. So on the Sydney going over, we all become skullheads, because that was the only way that I could cut hair. We just took it all off, very similar to what my hair is today, probably only a little bit shorter. That was my job. That was really the only job I took on the Sydney. Many others were put in to help prepare food, cleaning, mopping, just jobs to occupy us, to take our mind off what was happening, where we were going. They ferried us ashore in landing craft at Vung Tau. Gunships circled us all the time, American helicopters for our protection. We were very vulnerable. We didn't really know whether we were going to meet the Viet Cong when the landing barges of the ramps of the landing barges went down or not. When we did arrive on the beach, the soldiers from the battalion that we were replacing were actually sitting around, clean, tidy, clean shaven. They were very relaxed. They were going home. We had just arrived. Once again, they had been there, they'd done it. They'd done their time, and we were swapping places. The first thing that really come to my mind in memory of Vietnam was the smell. There was fuel, there was grease, actually cordite, the vegetation, rotten fish, filthy harbour, filthy water. And then within a short period of time, you've seen filthy people. We were told that our enemy would probably be wearing black pyjamas. Everyone we seen wore black pyjamas. We didn't know if they were the enemy. We were bundled onto the back of open trucks with all our kit and weapons and headed off to Nui Dat. One thing probably that comes to mind that I've omitted to talk about or to say was that whilst we were on the Sydney, the day that we were issued with live ammunition, the personality of officers, senior NCOs, and indeed some normal NCOs, our immediate NCOs, the corporals, their attitude, their personality, it changed. To this day, I don't know whether it's because we had live ammunition, and they realised that not only could we shoot the enemy, we could also shoot them. But they began, or a different life began with the issue of live ammunition. We were made responsible. We knew that we were going to somewhere where our life would rely on that ammunition. And also, as I say, these people, the officers, they realised that they had to start treating us as companions, as friends, as mates, because their lives depended on us the same as our life depended on them. Yeah, so the trip from Vung Tau to Nui Dat took place on the open trucks. It was certainly an experience to be in a foreign country, having never ever been outside Australia, to see the way third world countries actually lived. The buildings were just rubbish, straw, sheets of iron. Once again, the smells that were in the air and the countryside just had these tremendous smells. They were so strong. By the time I'd got to Nui Dat, in my mind, why would anyone want to ever fight for this country? What was it worth? It was of no financial value. The buildings were worth nothing. There was no industry that you could see of any concern along the highway, along the roads. The people were poor, peasants, driving ox carts with straw or wood on them. So it was probably a relief not only to arrive at Nui Dat safely, but to actually be back in something that looked familiar, and that was an army camp. On arrival, we were taken to our different company areas. We were allocated tents, 4-man tent, 3-man tent. These were Second World War vintage tents. They were all sandbagged up and metal put around them for protection from rockets or mortars. Within these tents there were pallets as floorboards. There was a bed, a normal military iron bed, rubber mattress, a bedside table and a metal locker. I went to Vietnam as a machine gunner. I was carrying the M60 machine gun. It was the main firepower of a section. It was capable of firing 660 rounds a minute. It was also the most heaviest, cumbersome weapon that a section had to carry. The ammunition was in linked belts. I had been used to carrying 2,000 rounds linked around my shoulders, over my webbing, like a bandolier, like the old Mexican bandits. That was what we looked like. The heat was phenomenal. It was hard to understand how we would actually set out and patrol in the heat because you were flat out acclimatising to it. First, I don't know, probably a week was spent within Nui Dat, learning where everything was, learning how to do picket. We had to actually do sentry picket right from the word go. Stepping off those vehicles, we had to secure our perimeter of Nui Dat. We had command posts set up. They were usually about, from memory, 50 metres apart. A machine gun had to be there, the M60 machine gun was there, and it had to be manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Weapons training was continued. We went to the rifle range virtually on a daily basis to test fire your weapon, clean your weapons. You were kitted out with different webbing, different ration packs, American ration packs, lightweight ration packs compared to the Australian 7-day ration packs. And we were probably prepared for our first shakedown operation, which was to be in the Nui Tai Mountains, which were close proximity to Nui Dat and supposedly a reasonably safe area. The first operation really was just to climatise us, to get us used to the heat, to get us used to walking, carrying the packs for longer periods than normal. Well, they seemed longer. We had done it in Australia, but we just were not used to the heat and the conditions that we would be under. There was alcohol in Nui Dat, and really alcohol was the only form of relaxation that we had. We had the pictures. Many of the blokes fell for the normal joke that there was a dance at Wa Long on every Saturday night, which plenty of nice Vietnamese women were there for us to go off and go to the local dance. We soon found out that this was the biggest joke that they played on all the new recruits or people that arrived in Vietnam, and it just didn't happen, of course. I suppose it was just preparing for the unknown. We'd been told, we'd been trained, but you really didn't know what you were going to walk into when you walked outside that wire of Nui Dat. Our first operation, as I said, took place about a week after. We virtually were sent on a forced march. we were just flogged, carrying all our gear, long periods of time. We were shitted off. We didn't understand why we were doing this sort of patrolling when we were told and trained that it would be different. We were told we would not move of a night time. Our first operation proved this wrong. We were forced to move of a night. We had very little enemy contact, or our company had very little enemy contact in that initial period. However, other companies within the battalion were involved in quite heavy contacts with the Viet Cong, mostly guerrilla elements. I remember on one particular instance where we had moved of a night, our company commander, our original company commander, the chap that we had no respect for, was still with us at this time. He took us on this march around these Nui Dat mountains of a night. At one time, a chap next to me in the pitch dark took his pack off. When he went to pick it up, it wasn't there, it was gone. At first light the next morning, he picked it up and it was some 40 metres below where he was standing. We were on the edge of a cliff face and we had no idea that that's where we were, and that was one of the main reasons why you didn't move at night time. You couldn't turn a torch on to see where you were going or anything like that, because you become a target. The enemy would see you. So that was very frightening in the instance that not only could you be shot at, but we could have been injured by walking over the side of a cliff without actually having even fired a shot in anger. The culmination or the end of this operation was to be a cordon and search of a village called Wa Long. It was only probably 4 or 5 kilometres from Nui Dat. To cordon and search a village, we had been trained to do this. It involved surrounding a village under the cover of darkness, or indeed it was done later in our tour in daylight hours. But for the element of surprise, it was done under darkness, whereby the whole battalion would be used to surround the village, completely surround the village on the outskirts of it. For our company this night, it involved leaving the base of the Nui Dat mountains and marching or patrolling some 10,000 metres across open rice paddies, across roads, through some rubber plantation, to arrive at our location that we were given to occupy, ready for the cordon and search at daylight the next morning. One thing that I remember about this long march was actually walking off the end of a paddy bun. At the end of a paddy bun there was like a cesspool whereby the Vietnamese would flick water from one rice paddy to the other, and they would do it with a canvas bag, and that was their irrigation. I'd actually walked in the darkness, I had walked right into this, and with the weight that I had on, my pack, the weapon, by this stage I wasn't just carrying 2,000 rounds of linked ammunition, I was carrying 8,000 rounds of linked ammunition. I went probably to my chest in mud, in slush, buffalo shit, rice, crap. We could not sing out or say, "Hey, I'm in here." We didn't know whether the enemy were on the opposite rice bun, the paddy bun, watching us. I could see fellow soldiers or my mates passing me by, walking past me on the paddy bun. Finally they stopped and the word come back down, "Where's Leis? Where's Leis?" And I could hear it coming along the line. When the digger, who was right next to where I was in the mud, so to speak, I had held the M60 above my head and I was still sinking. I think he got a bigger fright when I answered him than he probably ever got in all the time he was there. It took 4 blokes to get me out of that mud, and I was covered in mud from here down. No way of cleaning it off, no way of getting rid of the stench. The main thing that I was worried about was that the weapon was dirty. Would it fire with all the rubbish and the mud and the crap that was in it? So once I was located and we headed off again at around about 4 a.m. or 0400 in our army time, a tremendous firefight developed. Some 300-400 metres directly to our front. On our radio we heard that D Company had come under contact. They had took a turn, whether it was a wrong turn. They had walked into a minefield. It was outside a ARVN, or the South Vietnamese Army outpost, that was on the edge of the village of Hoa Long. Because they had walked into the minefield, the ARVN soldiers automatically thought they had come under attack from the Viet Cong. So they opened fire with heavy machine guns and small arms. So not only did the soldiers of D Company have injuries and wounds from shrapnel from the mines that they detonated, they were injured by actual friendly fire from the ARVN outpost. We could do nothing. Just sit there and listen on the radio as to what was happening, of the calls for assistance, for medevac, of trying to liaise with the American advisor who was in the compound with the ARVN soldiers by radio, that they were friendly people, that they weren't Viet Cong. We felt fairly helpless in being so close but unable to do anything. We weren't allowed to move because we could have walked into a minefield, the same. The map reading had gone wrong, our intelligence hadn't been right. Come daylight, when we actually did finally move into our position to partake in the coordinate search, from memory there was 3 diggers, officers, an officer, a sergeant and a corporal dead, and quite a few diggers wounded. One of the wounded, Eric Gray, had been with me right through from day one. So Eric's tour had ended. He was severely wounded. He was eventually medevac back to Australia. That was the first realisation that we were in a war zone, that people would die, friends would die, friends would be wounded. The coordinate search took place, took all day. There were Viet Cong apprehended within the village. There was caches of weapons found, caches of food. We seen at first hand how the white mice, or the Vietnamese police and the ARVN soldiers, did interrogation of their fellow countrymen. That in itself was frightening. They pointed weapons at people's heads, at women's heads, at children, to try to extract information from suspected enemy personnel. It was frightening, and it was inhuman to see people treated that way. Freddie, who was a mate of mine, to liven things up a little bit during this time, or after the Viet Cong had been apprehended, Freddie decided he would do a little bit of shooting practice. He made the company stand too, and when we found out he was shooting chooks, he decided he'd pop off a few chooks just to let a bit of steam off and to make sure his weapon was working. In hindsight, his actions really let all the pressures that were held within from that day go. We laughed, we joked, we even joked at the treatment that we had seen handed out to the Vietnamese people. It was a release. It was black humour, and that black humour was to form the biggest part of our survival. It was a coping mechanism. It helped us to survive and to handle the hardships and the sad times that were to come. End of the day, we were loaded into APCs and ferried back to Nui Dat, straight to the alcohol. The alcohol was your relaxation. I found out that Eric had been shot. Eric Gray, the chap I spoke of, had been hit in the skull and had lost part of his skull. Possible brain damage. He had lost all the facilities down his left side of his body, and he would be medevaced back to Australia. There was never any chance to say goodbye. He was never seen of or spoken of. I seen Eric in 1992 at Canberra. Partly he had survived. Mentally he was okay, but physically he had lots of problems. Tremendous friendship, mateship was still there. From there on, after that operation, things became, well, they were routine in so much as you just did the same thing day in, day out. Nightly routine was the same. Operations existed from anything from 2 weeks to 6 weeks, living in the jungle. Operations were given a name. They usually consisted of patrolling by day, ambush by night. The body got used to very, very little sleep and tremendous exertion, tremendous physical exertion. I was still carrying the section machine gun at this stage. It was a respected position. When you got into the shit, as it was called, it was the main weapon that could either extract you or it could control the situation. It was the main firepower of the section. My number 2 on the gun was Matt, a fellow veteran who I had actually done all my training with. Matt and I were a team, not only in the jungle, but in the boozer. We had lots of fun times, we had lots of laughs. Revenge became a really big part of our daily makeup. Vengeance, the body count, which Vietnam veterans, the Vietnam War and the Vietnam veterans relate that the body count was what the war was run on. It was a means of measuring success. God knows why, but that's how it was operated on. Even the Americans, everything had to relate to a body count. We kind of dehumanized our enemy. They were given names, degradation, degrading. It was like losing respect for fellow human beings. It was some time before my attitude changed in so much as, in hindsight, I look back now and I know it was fun to kill. The adrenaline of being able to lay in ambush behind a weapon as capable as the M60, to see the enemy, the VC, approach, usually in single file, sometimes in groups, but mostly in single file, walking along tracks that we were ambushed. To be able to pull the trigger of that machine gun and not only kill the first soldier, but possibly 3 or 4 behind him. And you would keep the trigger on until they just disintegrated. That troubles me now. Further degrading of the enemy bodies, because we had to search the bodies looking for intelligence. Many times these bodies were of women, young children of both sexes. It was very, very hard to tell in the middle of the night or early in the morning when an ambush was sprung as to who you were actually killing. They were just black figures in the dark of night. Some of them were armed, some of them weren't. To lie in ambush, in wait, in hiding, along tracks, along rivers, to spring an ambush in the middle of the night or the early hours of the morning, and then to lie there, waiting for first light, listening to the cries, the agony the VC were in, the people who we had blown to pieces with claymore mines or machine guns, still hear it today. And as I said, at first light, we would sweep the area which we had ambushed, at times finding survivors of the carnage that we had unleashed, maybe with limbs missing, legs missing, but still alive somehow, still ready to shoot us. Most of them would have a pistol or a weapon at their hands. They had to be blown away, put out of their misery, so to speak, execution style. Bad memories. However, in saying all that and being troubled by it, it was still fun, and still the adrenaline rush was just something that you couldn't experience until you had done it. We had our own body count. We had our own tally card. It was the done thing to keep count of how many VC we had actually killed on a personal basis. This all changed when, in a contact, the people who were blown apart, the people who were killed, were my mates. That's when the vengeance and the revenge that I speak of come into play. Sure, it was still fun to kill, but to revenge for the injuries that had been inflicted upon fellow Australians, your friends, your mates, it became a vendetta. It was something you had to do. I suppose it was part of the survival that our training had taught us, kill or be killed. But having seen Australians and handled their bodies, their blood, they were different to the Viet Cong. To be reverent, or to give them the reverence, respect that they deserved, was sometimes very, very difficult and inadequate. To roll a fellow Australian's body up in a plastic sheet, a plastic hoochie, very, very hard to do. However, in doing that, it made it much easier to put a Viet Cong body into a very small, shallow shell scrape, a hole in the ground. His family, his brothers, his sisters, his mum and dad, or her, or their father or mother, they would never ever know how their son, their daughter, their uncles, their aunties died. They just disappeared in the jungle, never to be seen, never to be heard of, never to be able to be put to rest by their family. It was as if they just were taken off the face of the earth. Whereas at least the Australian soldier, he was flown back, his body was flown back to Australia. His family may not have understood it, but they had the chance to say goodbye. So revenge, as I said, and vengeance become part of survival, and it was an unhealthy part. Yeah, contact with the enemy, it increased with the longer you were in country. Early in the tour, the contact and firefights were a minimum. It appeared to me in hindsight that the operations were planned that way, in so much as the intelligence that told us or sent us in areas to look for the enemy actually knew the areas that would be hot and the areas that would be cold. It was as if they were training you in country with small contacts, the guerrilla enemy, which led you up into larger contacts and contact with the North Vietnamese regular soldier, who was really well armed, well trained, well disciplined, and not afraid to fight. The guerrilla soldier would kind of fire a couple of shots over his shoulder as he ran away, so to speak, and never really hung around to fight you. He would break contact, which was what was called, when you found enemy, it was called a contact. It was reported over the radio as contact. As soon as contact was reported, which was the first job of a radio reporter on a shot being fired, was to say contact and his call sign, a system would go into sequence whereby, first of all, dust-off helicopters would be alerted and put on standby. Gunships would also be alerted and put on standby. In some instances, they would move closer to the area where the Australians were in contact. So our support and our backup was very, very good. And it was especially good because we could call on American support. And the Americans were always just too willing to become involved in a firefight. They would monitor our radio net, and if they were even remotely in the area, they would offer and provide assistance, which was good to know, because by this time, as I said, you become to a degree dehumanized, and the belief in God, it goes, you just lose that, and God becomes replaced with weapons, firepower, helicopters, gunships, artillery. They become your God, because that's what keeps you alive. God didn't really seem to have too much to do with it. So our support was there, and it was quite often used. Once you made contact with the enemy, you usually knew within the first few seconds whether they were guerrilla or whether they were NVA, for the simple fact is that a contact with the guerrillas would probably only last 10, 15, 20 seconds maybe, whereas the NVA, he would come straight at you. He would not walk away from you. They would do the same contact drills as what the Australians would. They would try to outflank you. They would go to the high ground. Simple basic things that we'd been taught to prepare us for the jungle fighting, they knew them. They'd been doing them for 100 years, just about, in Vietnam. And in the jungle, a contact with the weapons, with the enemy, who had good weapons, was usually encountered in bunker systems. Their bunker systems were very, very well camouflaged. They usually were fed, or their access was by well-defined tracks. However, the tracks would be similar to a mirror maze, whereby they might lead nowhere. They could go round and round in circles, and then all of a sudden you would be in the middle of 20 or 30 bunkers, well built, well camouflaged, and well manned bunker systems. Once you found yourself in this position, it was usually a forward scout, an individual who would surmise, usually by being shot at, that he had arrived at this position, or in most cases, or in the lucky cases, he would actually fire the first shot, which would create a contact. So respect for the enemy, it grew. The revenge and the vengeance thing, it also grew. Because as Australian soldiers and your mates were wounded, injured, the need to retaliate, that grew too. I don't know whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. The only thing now, in the age that I've got to, and you question your values, I know now that a lot of the feelings and the actions that I did, they weren't very good. And they weren't good feelings to have. They weren't human. You see the Vietnamese people, or even just Oriental people today in Australia who live here as our neighbours, and you wonder, you know, did you kill their kids? Did you kill their brothers? So those thoughts are still there. I was involved in many ambush operations which resulted in enemy being killed. The Battle of Binh Ba was one of the biggest operations or exercises that the 5 Battalion was involved in during their tour. That resulted in over 150 bodies being laid out in the village square the day after the village was annihilated virtually by artillery, tanks, APCs and infantry. It was the first street fighting, so to speak, that I was involved in. We had had numerous contacts within the jungle, but had never actually fought hand to hand or face to face in a village, going from house to house. At this time, I lost a friend, Andy Drummond. Andy was a full-blooded Aboriginal. He had been with me through rookie, corps, battalion training, was in A Company in 5 RAR. Andy was shot accidentally by a fellow soldier whilst cleaning his weapon. He accidentally fired his rifle and shot Andy through the neck. Andy bled to death before the helicopters could even be overhead. A big loss. To see him die like that, utter waste. It was a different death or a different loss to having lost mates to the Viet Cong in firefights, because there it was either kill or be killed. But for Andy to die in that way, it was worthless and senseless. Probably then where I began to question the role to which we as Australians were playing in Vietnam. The protesters back in Australia, we read about those in the papers that our family sent over to us. You began to question the role that you took on a personal basis, the idea of having your personal body count. However, the bottom line was we were there and we were about halfway through our tour, and we still had 6 months to go, God willing, to survive. I went from being a machine gunner at this stage to being a forward scout. I still stayed in the same section, within the same platoon and same company. I don't know why I was put as a forward scout. The platoon commander just asked one day if I would do forward scout duties. It was one of the hardest, nerve-wracking positions to be in. And I really don't know how a forward scout did that job for the period of 12 months. I think I did it for about 6 to 8 weeks, and I was a nervous wreck at the end of that time. My next position was as platoon radio operator. I was carrying a 6 set, a 25 set on my back, as well as all my own personal webbing, ammunition and weapon, and food. Usually we carried food for 4 to 7 days. I'd taken up smoking by this time in my tour of Vietnam, because smoking used to curb your appetite and you didn't have to carry the weight of the food. I smoked for a number of years after my discharge from the army, but then I just give it up virtually overnight. From radio operator, I become a Section 2 IC, that is, a Lance Corporal, second in charge. I was with my original section commander, Corporal Sutter, Ted Sutter. We had a fine section, a group which had been to Vietnam, been together, been through training, and we thought we were a pretty well organised group. We went on an operation into the Long High Mountains in South Vietnam. It was an area that was well known for the carnage that mines could inflict. It was during this operation that a fellow platoon, 7 Platoon, was actually mined, and the platoon suffered horrific injuries and loss of life. 7 Platoon was sent out to an ambush position. They were doing something that was just totally out of the ordinary, or not so much out of the ordinary, but totally unknown. They had been ambushing a set track for a number of nights, going in at last light and coming out at first light of a day. On this particular night, the 4th of July, when moving into the position which they had occupied the previous night, a mine was detonated, followed by another mine. 3 people were killed instantly and 17 were wounded. Horrific injuries. Legs, arms, eyes, all gone. To evacuate these people, we used helicopters with landing lights on who hovered above. Silence of death, leadership qualities, and mates helping mates. Memories I'll never forget. This incident actually decimated a whole platoon within our company. I think there was only 3 individuals left who were not injured or were not returned to Australia. The platoon had to be rebuilt from people within the company and from reinforcements who were held within Nui Dat in the reinforcement wing. A reinforcement soldier had a lot of pressure on him. This pressure was put on us as well as them. They were the unknown. They hadn't been with your training. They hadn't been with you in contacts. You did not know how they would react, if they would handle contact, how they would handle their role required of them to keep you alive and to keep themselves alive. Unfortunately, many of these reinforcements were given a very, very hard time. They weren't trusted. They were given the shit jobs, and usually they were put as far away from possible contact with the enemy as possible. I was transferred from the 8th Platoon into 7 Platoon as a section commander. That was, I would have up to 8 to 10 men under my control. I was made a corporal. I could see then that the training or the jobs that I had done, they had actually, or the officers of the company had actually been moulding me for this role. I'd been a gunner, I'd been a scout, I knew how to operate a radio, I knew how to control men, or I thought I did. The new section and the new platoon was formed up. Many people within the company, the experienced soldiers so to speak, were given roles of command. We were dispersed in amongst the new reinforcements who come in to replace our lost and wounded. This was in July '69. Sandy McKinnon, who was an original 7 Platoon member, who had been wounded in the mines, having 17 or so pieces of shrapnel embedded in his back, came back to the platoon. He had been a machine gunner, but because of the injuries he sustained, he could no longer carry the belts of ammunition on his back. Why he was left in Vietnam, I do not know. I really think he should have been sent home. Sandy wanted to be my scout. Sandy was the biggest person in our company, size-wise, and also strength-wise. To follow Sandy through the jungle was like following a big bulldozer. He made it so easy. He was a good scout. I was also given a reinforcement, Jimmy McMillan. Jim was a nice, quiet, willing soldier. However, he was the unknown. Jim had one ambition in Vietnam, the same one that we all had when we first arrived there, and that was to shoot a Viet Cong. Operation Camden commenced on the 29th of July, 1969. We were to be clearance and protection for some American land clearing teams. They were huge roan ploughs, bulldozers, that would just drive through the jungle with chains attached, 16, 20 bulldozers in line, knocking down the jungle. We would go into the area the day before they were set to knock the jungle down, looking for the enemy, looking for mines, to clear the area. On the morning of the 29th of July, working with a tracker, that is a Labrador dog and a handler, Private Paddy Walker, my section in the lead, working with Paddy, discovered a sentry, an NVA soldier. Paddy shot this person. It was the first time in my tour that we had actually seen the enemy post sentries. It was something that we did every time we stopped or harboured or ambushed. We always had sentries out as early warning. This sentry was well dressed in khaki, a pith hat on, well armed, AK-47 rifle, extra magazines and ammunition in his pouches. We felt that we had come up against something that was different to what we had encountered. My platoon commander, who was a new platoon commander as the previous platoon commander was injured in the mines, Ian Hosey, called on me to go forward from where we were to reconnaissance, or do a recce as it was called, of the area to up to 500 metres ahead. Sandy as my scout, myself and Jimmy McMillan, who I took first of all to see how he would handle his job and to have him under my control and care. There was also a fourth person, a radio operator, who to this day I cannot remember his name or who he was. We advanced from where we were. We found well-defined tracks. We seen signs from where trees 6 to 8 inches in circumference had been cut down. This was normal when you were finding or looking or expected to come upon a bunker system. The trees had had mud and leaves attached to the trunks or to the base so that they could not be seen from overhead or aerial surveillance. By this time it was 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Rain had begun to fall, as was the norm for that time of the day. We advanced at a very, very slow rate, the four of us. We were spread out probably over 75 to 100 metres between Sandy and the last person who was the radio operator. What we seen and encountered that afternoon was horrendous. I had seen injuries, I had seen death, but I had never seen mutilation of fellow human beings. We knew that we were in proximity of a very, very large enemy force and that they were possibly, or most probably, dug in a bunker system. They were on the high ground, i.e. on top of a hill, the top of a knoll. These victims that we had seen were pegged out. There were 3 of them. I will not go into the mutilation. 2 were definitely still alive. The 3rd, I don't know. Sandy, upon seeing these, called me forward. He went further forward. I had no idea and no knowledge what to do. Jim came up and was physically sick. I executed, in my mind, now it was execution, those bodies. I just fired one shot from my Armalite rifle through their forehead. After firing these shots, movement was observed by myself directly ahead of where I was. 2 NVA soldiers, dressed similarly to the sentry we had shot previously, were approaching where we were. My firing of the 3 shots probably had attracted their attention, and they had come to see what was happening or going on. I fired the rest of my Armalite magazine into these 2 people, who were both hit, dead or wounded, I don't know. At this time, the 4 of us, Sandy had come back to where I was, came under huge, tremendous fire. Automatic weapons, RPGs, the noise, the adrenaline. I really cannot say exactly what took place from then on. We did retreat, or went back, using fire and movement to our platoon position. How the 4 of us got back without being hit or wounded is beyond us to this day. I reported everything that had taken place except what took place with regards to the poor wretches on the ground. I don't know why I didn't report that. I felt that I had done something wrong. On talking to the other 3 blokes, we decided we would never ever say anything about that at that time. I reported to my platoon commander Ian Hosey of what had taken place, of how we had come under fire. On our retreat back to the platoon area, the NVA actually followed us up. Upon hitting the company, or the platoon area, which was by then the rest of the company had come up to support us, they retreated away from the more firepower that they encountered. The heads, or our platoon commander and the company 2IC, who was in charge at the time as our CO was away, decided that we would do a platoon attack onto the bunker system, which we estimated to be on the high ground to our direct front. As a section leader, and having encountered and seen what I believed to be there, I refuted this decision. By this time it was probably 4 o'clock, the rain was pouring, the jungle was dark, and we were heading into the unknown. However, the platoon attack did take place, led by my section, Sandy being the forward scout, myself, and once again Jim right on my hammer, followed by my machine gun group. We decided to come in from a different angle to the area where the bunker system was suspected. We headed off in single file. I don't think I'd ever been as scared in all my life. We'd advanced some 400 metres. We once again seen signs of bunkers being prepared, that is, the trees being cut down. There was a well-defined track. Sandy gave the enemy sign. I went forward to where Sandy was. He said, "I just seen enemy." My reaction was, "Why didn't you shoot the bastard?" Sandy said he'd dropped down a hole. I could not see where Sandy was talking about. He stood up to move forward to investigate, myself and Jim going with him. We were no more than a metre apart. A tremendous firefight started. Sandy lay at my feet in front of me, his chest wide open, his weapon blown to pieces. I called on Jim to help me with Sandy. The fire, the small arms weapons, the RPGs that were going overhead was just deafening. There were bits of trees falling all over us. There was dust. Where the dust come from, I've no idea. It had been raining. Maybe it was smoke. Even to this day, I still do not really recollect everything that took place. I moved forward. I seen the side entrance of a very large bunker. There were 2 soldiers in there. I emptied my Armalite weapon into the bodies of these 2 people. I returned to where Sandy was lying, calling for Jim for support. Sandy crawled onto my shoulders. How I carried him, I don't know. On passing Jim, who was lying on the ground, face down, who kind of had his arms folded across his forehead, just lying on his arms. I actually abused him. I carried Sandy to where my platoon commander was, and the platoon medic was there. I dropped him. I had a conversation with the platoon commander, and I went back along the line to where the firefight was taking place. The platoon had moved up in our support. I went straight to Jim and rolled him over. He was dead. He'd been shot through the heart. He never had even seen the person that shot him, so he never got to shoot a VC. My words, the physical things that I had done and called Jim, just come rushing back. They still haunt me today. We extracted ourselves. It was dark. We carried Jim's body back to where the rest of our company was harboured up, some 500 metres from the bunker system. We used gunships, helicopters, gunships, to help extract ourselves. We called in artillery. However, the NVA kept hugging us, that is, keeping as close as possible to us. They knew that that was the best place to be, that they wouldn't be hit with the air support. It was dark. A medevac chopper had been called in to extract Sandy, who, as I said, had a hole in his chest. It was like half the size of a football. With the CSM, Company Sergeant Major Jack Lake and myself, using a bomb crater as an area where the helicopter could hover, we walked out on a log, a fallen tree, and placed Sandy on what was known as a jungle penetrator. The helicopter hovered in the dark. It began to receive small arms fire from the ground. NVA were firing at it. The NVA used a green tracer in their bullets, whereas the Australians used red. As soon as Sandy was on the jungle penetrator, Jack Lake told the helicopter to get out. Move. Sandy was pulled through the trees whilst hanging onto the jungle penetrator. I never seen Sandy again after that until 1988. That night I slept with Jim's body within arm length of me. Well, I didn't sleep. I spent the night with Jim's body. The next morning we were reinforced with APCs and armoured tanks, Centurion tanks. It was hard to see Jim's body just rolled up in a plastic hoochie, put into the back of an APC. It was just like a bundle of rubbish. That was the last I was to ever see of Jim's body. Yeah, that night, longest night of my life, spent in a harbour position. We had Spooky, who flew around our position all night, just firing. Spooky was a DC-3 and had Gatling guns in the base of it. It used to come in and it'd just go brrrr, and it would put around, I believe, every 6 inches over 8 football fields in one burst. We were supported by them all night because the NVA kept probing our position. As I said, the tanks and the tracks come up the next morning. We did a sweep of the area. The enemy was gone. Just pulled out, disappeared overnight. Late that afternoon, I was lifted out of that area as I was due to go on R&R the next day. I spent the first night in the fire support base waiting for return back to Nui Dat. The next morning I flew back to Nui Dat. I showered, put my polys on, ribbons, grabbed a port, was flown to to Benoit, then to Tonsanut, where I boarded a Air America, I think it was, or an American plane, which flew us back to Sydney. I had come from death to the safety of Sydney in a matter of 24 hours. I had 8 days, 10 days R&R, 1 day home, 1 day back, 8 days in Australia. To this day, I don't know how I got through those days. I could not speak of what had taken place. I could tell no one, least of all Glenn. I couldn't tell of the carnage that I had seen, encountered, had actually done to fellow human beings. Everything had to be fine. Everything had to be okay. Portray the feelings that I was safe. I had my 21st birthday in those 8 days. I had love, family, and safety. It was great. It was a happy family time. I had a family ceremony, a reunion for my 21st birthday. I did not want a party. I had told that to Mum and Dad by letter. I just wanted to be at home, quiet, and it was unreal to sleep in a bed after having been sleeping on the ground, or not actually sleeping, lying on the ground, usually wet, usually scared. So my R&R was a tremendous relief in many ways to be back home and be in Australia, but I really don't know how I got through it. Went back to Vietnam by Qantas, once again, to go from Sydney, Mascot, to Tonsanut, from love, safety, fun place, to that horrible place again. You just can't put it into words. The transformation, you couldn't comprehend it. I was back in Nui Dat. Within 4 hours I was back in charge of my section, back in the jungle. Tour continued, much the same as before, different operations. It was in September, late August, early September, during a contact in which we took casualties, wounded casualties. We called in artillery support to soften the area or to make the enemy pull out before we could extract these casualties. It was during this artillery barrage that I myself became one of the wounded, either through our calling in the artillery too close or a drop shot. I was actually blown over into the fork of a tree and sustained severe spinal injuries. My legs went numb. I couldn't really walk. Well, I couldn't walk. I do not really know if my recollections of the time that I was injured is correct, if it's in my imagination, or if it's a distortion of the actual events. Many years later, after Vietnam, that platoon commander came to me in Brisbane and he told me that it was whilst organising the evacuation of the wounded, one of which later died of his wounds, that I was blown from a log whilst using the radio. I don't know what took place. In my medical records, it has that it was a non-enemy, fell off a log whilst organising a medevac chopper. I was lifted out in the dark in what was known as a Stokes litter. It was a wire basket in which you laid. It was night. It was an American helicopter. I remember very, very little of actually getting to the stage was a huge relief. I was taken to the American hospital at Long Binh. The next day I was transferred to the Australian base hospital, 1st Military Hospital in Vung Tau. The doctors there did not really know what injuries I had. They knew that they were severe. I had no real physical cuts or abrasions. I was very, very badly bruised and swollen. I still couldn't use my legs. Whilst in Long Binh in the American hospital, they said that I would have to undergo spinal surgery. When I got to the Australian hospital, they said they would do nothing whilst I was in Vietnam, that I would have to be returned to Australia. I was kept in the hospital in Vung Tau for a period of time for stabilisation. I was then put on a Hercules aeroplane with many other wounded and injured veterans and taken to Butterworth, Singapore, where I was taken off the plane as I was unfit to continue the journey. I was held over there in the RAF hospital for a number of days, and then again I was placed on another Hercules and brought back to Australia, eventually ending up in One Mill Hospital in Brisbane. Glenn had been sent the telegram that I was injured, but no other particulars. When she came to the hospital at Yeronga, she was told of my injuries and the possibility that I would not walk or walk properly. I spent a long period of time in the Yeronga hospital. However, the doctors and the specialists that were there had decided that even though my spine was cracked, that they would try to let nature take its course. That was to see if it would mend and to see what I could do physically as far as gaining momentum with my body. On research of my medical records now, there is nothing held. It has been either destroyed, lost, or misplaced. From that period of time until I was discharged from the Army. During that time I underwent that much physiotherapy, walking on crutches, walking in walking frames. However, I was determined that I would overcome my injuries. Glenn and family were great support. Even the Army was of good support. The doctors were good. The nurses were good. Eventually I was discharged from the hospital. I was able to walk out of the hospital. I was then posted to a personnel depot at Enoggera until my discharge in November of 1970. I was still receiving medical treatment, mostly physiotherapy and pain-killing injections. The Army arranged for me to become a public servant and work within the Department Army at Meander in Brisbane. I continued in this job for approximately 3 years, and that was the period of time that I still received medical treatment for my injuries. At the end of that time, I had had enough of the Army, I had had enough of people, and I just wanted to disappear. In civilian life, I found that I could tell no one of what took place in Vietnam. Glenn had no idea of what I'd been through. In actual fact, she wasn't even to learn until some 20 years later of how I was actually injured. I refused to talk about Vietnam. It was as if I just didn't want it to exist. The Australian people rejected Vietnam veterans. I personally did not come across that rejection until many years later in 1997 actually. However, I seen what happened to other people and other veterans, and I did not want to experience that. So I told no one, even family, my brothers. They had no idea of what had taken place in that time that I was in Vietnam. I had a family, a wife, a child. When I come home on my R&R, I had the huge fortune of having saved $900 in 9 months of being shot at, of doing the things that I'd done for a pittance of $900. Between Glenn, myself, and my parents' help, and using my war service loan, we bought our first home. I could not work for a boss. I went private contracting, working for myself with a huge international company. I was fitting their products to offices, homes. However, I was working for myself and I was in charge. I became a workaholic. I couldn't sleep of a night. Glenn would quite often find me of a night, a lather of sweat, sometimes at the side of the bed, sometimes in a different room. She didn't understand this. The nightmares, the dreams, whereby my mates had been replaced by my family, my friends back home, and they were the injured ones. I really began to question the role that I had played in Vietnam, but I held this all within myself. I was working 16, 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. The dollar became my God to provide. The building trade was booming. There was ample work. I really think I probably could have worked 24 hours a day, but I used to have to get that 4, maybe 5 hours sleep a night. Glenn for a long time just accepted this work and my determination that it was just to provide. Then she began to see that it was to hide that not sleeping and not coping. I became a very angry person. I did not trust anyone. I didn't even trust her. We tried to have more family. It didn't work. Finally, Glenn did fall, but miscarriage took it away from us. The Agent Orange thing was very much up front, and people were talking about it. In years to come by, we were to learn that amongst many veterans who had been in amongst the toxic chemicals, as I was, that miscarriage after Vietnam service was quite common. Finally, in 1973, we had our second child, a daughter, and then again in 77, we had our last child, another son. Probably for the next 20 years, because they had a good mother, and that was really all that kept our family together. These children had a father they didn't know. He was there, but he was very silent. He was very, very strong on discipline. They had everything. They had plenty of worldly things, but they didn't have love. However, they stuck with me, and Glenn stuck with me. And in 1988, my injuries, unbeknown to me, began to have their toll and catch up with me. I thought I was just getting old and lazy. I could no longer pour concrete. I could no longer lift heavy loads. I could no longer work hard. I was still working 16 or 18 hours a day. Glenn had tried to get me to slow down, and I had actually went back to working to one job. However, this only lasted for about 3 months, and I just had to get out of a night. I could not stay in the house of a night. In 1988, I said that I had to go away. They could either come with me or they could stay behind. We come back to our normal life late that year. For a little while, my life was easier. But it wasn't long before I was back into my old routine. No sleep, nightmares. I become a solitary, lonely figure. Couldn't share anything, couldn't share my feelings. I learnt of the suicide of fellow veterans that I'd served with. Many, many, many suicides, a frightening number. More than that is actually recorded. Many died in suspicious circumstances that have just been written down as exactly that. In 1990, Glenn, my wife then, of 24 years, gave me an ultimatum to either get help or get out. I went to my local doctor and tried to explain to him what was happening with me, physically and mentally. Physically, they began the research or looking into my problems with scans and x-rays. They told me that I was heading towards major spinal surgery. Mentally, they sent me off to a psychiatrist. I went to Greenslopes Private Hospital, which was then Repatriation Hospital. I was virtually told that all war veterans who had seen combat have bad memories, to get on with life, to get over it. I was given some pills that were supposed to help me sleep and told to go back to work. I did this for the next 3 years, once again going back to working long hours. I did confide in Glenn a little and speak with her and tried to explain of my problems. Physically, I wasn't coping. I couldn't work hard. I kept going back to see an orthopaedic surgeon who kept telling me that sooner or later I would have to have spinal operations. 1994, August, I went to work. The 9th of August was a normal working day. The 10th of August, I reported to Greenslopes Hospital, seen an orthopaedic surgeon, Dr. Peter Sharwood. He said that I needed emergency spinal repairs. He would either do these tonight or tomorrow morning. The operation that I undertook, I wasn't prepared for it. When I woke up, I thought that I was back in Vietnam. The pain, I couldn't move. I really didn't know what had happened to me. I was to find out that once he opened up my spine, the injuries that he found had been there since I was injured in Vietnam. My spinal cord was actually eroded and was leaking to a degree. I was that far from becoming confined to a wheelchair. I wasn't prepared for the operation. I wasn't given any time to be prepared for it. I had a house to build the next day. I was to start a brand new building. I was in hospital for that operation for probably about 3 weeks. I just forget now exactly. It was in 5 weeks' time from the 10th of August that I was due to walk my daughter down the aisle to be married. Here I was. I couldn't even get off of bed. Vietnam was back. Daytime, nighttime, 24 hours a day. The injuries took me back there. However, once again, I'd beat it before and I was going to beat it again. Through the help of physiotherapists at Greenslopes and a private one close to home. Glenn gave up work to look after me. She had to bath me, help with the toilet, feed me. I don't really know. I'd say it probably took 3 years. I know the next operation was in 1997 and they wouldn't do that one until I was mobile from the first one. I virtually learned to walk again. I was told never ever to even contemplate going back to physical work. The Veteran Affairs looked after me medically without question. They did not even balk. Whatever I needed, I was given. However, when it come to giving me compensation in the way of a pension, a brick wall was put up. You're young enough to find another job. You could find employment in an office somewhere. I knew I couldn't go back to doing that sort of work. Mentally, I went downhill. We were using our own savings to exist on. I was fighting with the Veteran Affairs to gain my right for compensation. I couldn't understand whereby they would pay thousands and thousands of dollars for an operation to repair me physically, but they wouldn't help me really mentally. Sure, they paid for me to talk to a psychiatrist or a counsellor. They told me to go off to the Vietnam Veterans Counselling Service. But talk didn't help. Talk only made me worse. It made me angry, and it made me determined that I would be recognised. I haven't really said too much about Glenn and how she stood by me in all those years. In lots of times she just had no idea what was going on within my mind or where I even was. I could be sitting there talking to her, but mentally I was just not there. I was, elsewhere. And I wouldn't open that window to let her into where I was or where I was going or thinking about. It would have been pretty hard for her to continue a relationship like that. The children, to this day, they still stand by me as Dad, Grandpop. So over that period of time, I feel that my service in Vietnam, even though I openly admitted, even in the interview, it was the biggest adventure I set out on my life. There hasn't been a day gone by since that it hasn't affected my life in some way. Something I think anyone or any veteran that went to Vietnam, whether they're at the sharp end of the stick, as we call it, the infantry in the jungle, or whether they're back in the base camp, I do really feel that they were affected mentally in some way. You just never ever knew who your enemy was over there. They were your friend by day, your enemy by night. Instances of giving our extra rations to orphanages, a village orphanage in Berea, going out on operation 2 days later only to ambush the VC carrying the rations that we'd give to the orphanage 2 days prior. Now whether the orphanage had actually give those rations to those people or whether they'd come in and taken them under gunpoint, we never knew. So you never really knew who your enemy was. You could be putting something in his hand, helping him out by day, and that night he'd be pulling the trigger or blowing a mine up under your feet. So yeah, to go on from there, during those years I was told that I had a disease or a condition known as PTSD. When PTSD was first told to me or come to light verbally, I didn't know where to look for it. Is it in my feet? Is it in my belly? Where is it? What is it? And then it was explained to me, and I must have had PTSD from, after a couple of days in country in Vietnam, because they've always just been memory days or, flashbacks to me. I never ever really knew that it was PTSD. And that PTSD would not only affect me mentally, it would affect me physically. It affects your brain, it affects the way you think. And when Glenn and I sit down now and we have a bit of a talk and we talk about how I'm going or how I'm travelling and how I am physically or how I am mentally, it's so much easier now because we can see why I was affected and what it did to me over those years where I just kept it all bottled up. It made me the person that I was. It was just a way of coping, Maybe if I'd opened up earlier, I might have been helped earlier. So I really can't blame anyone for that. That was only my decision and the way I was. Over the years, there's a little saying that I've quite often related to, and it has to do with my service in Vietnam. There's a question, hey, what was it like over there? I say, where? Nam, what was it like in combat? I tried to pause. I can't tell you. Question, weren't you in combat? You were injured, I guess, but I'm home now. I am trying to believe the war is over. So that's where I really am today, to convince myself that it is over. I can look back, I can see how all the different things have affected me. I still can smell the smells that I smelt then. I love helicopters. I can be in bed, freezing cold, but if a helicopter goes over, I get up and go and look at it. So there's been some good things out of it. I did believe when I went to Vietnam that I was following in my father's footsteps, who fought in the Second World War. But I think his war was a war that I would fight in again. But if I had my war over again, I don't think I would fight in my war again. I just don't think the end results warranted the carnage and the deaths that it caused to the young males of Australia. Even now, when you look back on Agent Orange, the death rate of Vietnam veterans, the mortality study that they've done, it is showing that Vietnam veterans are dying at a much younger age. It's been proven, whether it's the effect of Agent Orange or alcohol abuse or drug abuse, I really don't know. But I do know it's on my mind. It's there in the back of my mind. Is it going to affect me as well? For many years I did. I used alcohol to hide feelings. I'm very lucky I've never ever really succumbed to high alcohol abuse. As I said, I was a workaholic. I don't know, I seem to handle my inner feelings in a different way to many others. Some become abusive, they physically abuse people, they become that angry that they couldn't control themselves. I have become that angry, but the only way I can handle myself is to walk away from something at that time, and I've been lucky that I have been able to do that. Different things during my life. When Cyclone Tracy went through Darwin, that brought Vietnam just back into my lounge room, like it was there. It was like going through villages and the Battle of Binh Ba, and to see the carnage that was there, that was just flattened, completely flattened. And that's the sort of thing that war does, like bombs and mines and things like that. It just actually destroys lives, homes, possessions, and also memories. It destroys good memories, your belief in things, for God to let these things happen naturally. Why would he do that when it affects so many people in a negative way? So each day now, I just kind of take each day as it comes. I was given the opportunity to talk to you today, and I thought that was a privilege. It's been emotional, but I think in the long run, it will be very good for me. It's the second chance I've had to speak out and to say what I thought. That's why I've got this little comic book, as I call it, on here. A few years ago, through the Vietnam Veterans Counselling Service, I did a course called A Walk Through Vietnam. It was the first time in my life that I had the opportunity to maybe speak out, or I didn't actually speak out, I put it on paper of where I was growing up, the things that affected me, the movies, the lifestyle, the values of Graham Thorne's kidnapping in Sydney, a boy my age who was found dead after his kidnap ransom was set. The Beatles, the music, free love, alcohol, cars, women, the rejection of rules, virtually all through my life, rebelled against superiors. It gave me the opportunity to actually look at my life. There was a saying in the 60s, a friend with weed was a friend indeed. I think many of the young people today could probably relate to that. However, it was against morals. It was against the law. During the program, we looked at what we did before we went to Vietnam and what we believed in. I was following in my father's footsteps. I believed in the domino theory of how Australia was under threat from communism, in the domino theory of that it would just keep coming down towards Australia. The young national servicemen and the regular army supplement and the regular army, they were the cream of the Australian youth. I was proud to be one of them. We were fit. You weren't sent if you weren't fit, and you weren't sent if you weren't morally capable. The only thing they didn't tell us in that time is that there were Australian casualties too. I went through Vietnam. I did get injured, but I went through it. And even stating all that, I'm still glad that I was part of it. It has affected my life, but I'm proud of what I did. For my country anyway. I'm not proud of all the way my mind thought and handled things over there, but that was a way of coping. It was just a way of getting through each day or each night. When I come home, stress became part of my life. I felt very much isolated from people who had been friends that I had known for years, grown up with. They didn't even know that I'd been to war. They just thought I'd been away working for some time. The national servicemen that I served with, they were great. They were as good as anyone, and very proud to be with them. I've seen Harold Holt disappear and drown, or believed to drown. I've seen Mr. Gordon stand up and say, I can be Prime Minister. He even come to Vietnam whilst I was there and said, good on you, mate. Great help that was. It was all part of that era, part of me growing up, of arriving in Nui Dat. As I've said, live ammo, the real thing, the dust, the smells, the herbicides, to see the planes, the C-47s, the Hercules spray each afternoon. Smoke, oil, perspiration, humidity, blood, fear, fuel, vegetation, intestines, smells you just will never ever forget. Once they're in there forever. The humour that we used, the black humour, we laughed at anything. One day, whilst in Vietnam, one particular instance, under contact, I had all my webbing and gear on. The only visible part of me, the VC, the enemy could see was my pack. Every time I moved, there was a bullet put through my pack. I was sure that I had been shot. I could feel the stickiness all over my back. But I didn't feel awful. I didn't feel injured. I felt okay. I couldn't feel anything. It was a tin of peaches that was in my pack that had been blown apart. I called to my buddies, what's happening? We're waiting for an artillery barrage to come in to help you get out from where you are, because I couldn't move. Every time I moved, the enemy shot. Rastus, our machine gunner, he was a Englishman, never ever stopped telling Rastus jokes. I said to him, what's the time? His answer was, 22, Leis. A number of times. I said, how much longer till the barrage? How much longer? It seemed an eternity. Again, what's the time? 22. 22 what? 22 tits on 11 Sheilas, he sung out in the middle of the jungle. I laughed. We all laughed. Under fire. And here we are lying on the ground laughing. It was funny humour. There was lots of things. There was fear, anxiety, survivor, support, achievement, trial by fire, of being ready, of being disciplined, of handling the shock. The bottom line was to kill or survive, to kill to survive. They told us of many instances whereby we had as much chances of being injured in Australia in a motor vehicle accident than by being in Vietnam. I've written here, crap. The casualties that America sustained are frightening and far, far outweigh any statistics that you would ever see off the Australian roads. During my time in Vietnam, there was different programs put into place. The Chu Hoi program, where leaflets were dropped from the sky, and supposedly if they were carried by a Viet Cong or an NVA soldier, they were a safe pass. They were to be honoured by all Allied forces. Tragically, this did not work. On many occasions when a Viet Cong body was searched, yeah, they had one of these stickers in their pocket, but they weren't carrying it to be seen. Many different things. The respect for our helicopters. That respect was God. God was there. He was in a helicopter. The Centurion tanks. If you were going into a bunker system, the best way to go was by Centurion tank. Didn't always happen. There was a 60s motto that formed part of the Nui Dat landing strip. A big sign, make love, not war. Also a 69er. This motto was always used when the opportunity arose. We went to church. We remembered our fallen mates. A young lieutenant who flew a little squirrel helicopter dropped ammunition to us whilst we were in contact, shot out of the sky. Thanks, Alan. What a poor excuse for your life. Of weapons captured, of the carnage that they used to inflict. But no matter how much infliction we inflicted on them, they just kept coming back. Of the minefields, of the biggest contact as a section commander that I had to endure and get through. I was a cocky section leader. I used to think I was sexy too. They thought he was capable of being tough and capable. How wrong I was. Is today only so true in my mind. Of the tortured victims found and put to rest. God will punish me for that one day. Of the young people that suffered, the young children, of the injuries they received. Where are they today? Who's helping them? I'm sure there's no Veteran Affairs in Vietnam that pays them a pension or gives them an artificial leg or looks after them when they're sick. The carnage, to see over 150 bodies laid out in a village square. Fellow human beings they were. They were laid out like dead animals, not the Australian way. Of coming home injured, of feeling that I had left my mates to continue on. That was a guilt. There was no honour to return to. The protesters were in the street. I had to hide from society, hide from the family, keep my feelings within. Where was I going? I was physically injured as well as mentally. Where was the future? Alcohol became a big part of my life, and work. I was safe at home with my family. I had love and friends. There were no bullets or mines in the Australian bush. To lie on the beach, you didn't have to worry about a Viet Cong sniper. Get well, let my body mend, was my main program in life in those immediate years after Vietnam. But don't tell anyone you've been to Vietnam. Golf come along, and his supporters. It's time, he said. The civilian world, we watched number 96 on TV and see glimpses of flesh and morals that we had only dreamt about. Little Paddy was doing the stomp. The surfing life that I had enjoyed in years gone by came back to light. The surf was good for me. It was clean, it was physical, and it was something that I could do myself. Isolation was my life. I became a workaholic. Work, work, work. Day in, day out. I still carried the shame that I held within. I even tried to go back to God. I hadn't believed in God for many, many years. But upon going back to God and speaking with his representative, he told me what I already knew. Guilty. You will face God for your sins and actions you done in Vietnam. This was of no help to me. To lose my mate, Bluey Newbury, took his own life. The question today is still why. Blue carried them terrible memories of handling his mate's possessions and letters and packing up their gear when they were either killed or wounded. He carried these memories until the day that he died. How could I come home to a normal life? I had a son who was born in 67 at the age of 3 when I came home. A daughter who arrived in 73 and a son in 77. These children had a father for many years. They had a father they did not know or understand. Thank God they had a good mother. I'm trying to make amends for this now, especially to them. It's time to say thank you to many people. I thank the Veteran Affairs, family, friends, other veterans, doctors, counselling, and the many, many medications that get me through daily life. And to the nurses and doctors who served and looked after us.